Le vent dans les bois fait ouh, la bicheuse à bois fait meh, la vaisselle cassée fait fric fric frac, et les pieds mouillés font flic flic flac, mais boum, quand notre cœur fait boum, tout avec lui dit boum, l'oiseau dit boum, c'est l'orage, brrr, boum, l'éclair qui lui fait.
In the months following the outbreak of war in September 1939, French forces, seeing little action at the front, prayed for a hasty resolution to the troubles in Europe. However, following a number of swift, successful attacks in May 1940, Hitler's forces were soon making rapid progress through France. It was only a matter of weeks before German tanks would roll into their inevitable destination, Paris. Amongst those who had fled from Paris upon hearing of the German advance was the French gypsy jazz guitarist Django Reinhardt. He, along with thousands of others, would soon return to Paris, unsure how the City of Light would change under occupation. Less than a year earlier, in the summer of 1939, the quintet of the Hot Club of France, featuring both Django Reinhardt and violinist Stefan Grappelli, was at the height of its pre-war popularity in Europe. The outbreak of World War II would split the group up, though the stars of the quintet, Stefan and Django, continued their careers on opposite sides of the English Channel, Stefan in London, Django back in Paris. Paris would become the capital of jazz in occupied Europe during World War II, and the star at the centre of this jazz scene was Django. Both his racial origins and status as a jazz musician should have made him a target for Nazi persecution in Paris, given the official Nazi line on gypsies as a racially inferior people, and on jazz as a decadent music. And yet the occupation years were some of the most successful and lucrative in Django Reinhardt's life. This is the story of the rise of jazz in France, the Nazis' ambivalent relationship with it during the occupation, and of the survival of one of Europe's most important and inspirational jazz musicians. The Wall Street crash of 1929 brought an end to the strong dollar and thus to the high standard of living enjoyed by American expatriates in Paris, sending many home. Nevertheless, their indelible cultural, financial and intellectual mark had already been left on the city. Feeling the knock-on effects of the Depression by the early 1930s, the jazz scene in Paris was consequently in a state of flux. Many of those African-American musicians who had been living there throughout the 1920s, initially attracted to the vitality of the city and the racially more sympathetic environment in which to live and play, began to leave. Only the most popular American jazz artists, such as Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, could afford to play in Europe in this atmosphere of economic decline. Following this exodus of African-American musicians, a whole new generation of French jazz artists soon stepped in to take their place. Django Reinhardt was a prodigiously talented gypsy guitarist who had begun his career playing in the music halls and bal musette of Paris. It wasn't until 1931, when he first heard recordings of Venuti and Lang, Duke Ellington, and Louis Armstrong, that jazz really altered the trajectory of his career. So incomparable was their music with the rudimentary jazz he'd heard before, that he reportedly wept upon first hearing Armstrong's Indian Cradle song. Django quickly became a rising star in Parisian jazz circles in the early 1930s, performing for jazz fans, intellectuals, and rich dilettantes alike, all of whom were spellbound by the incredible facility with which he wove melodies out of thin air. It wasn't until the autumn of 1934 that his fortunes really began to change. One night at Claridge's, in the Champs-Élysées, a fortuitous jam session involving Django, Stefan Grappelli, and bassist Louis Vola resulted in the resolution to create a unique new jazz band. Django's brother Joseph and another rhythm guitarist soon joined to make the threesome into a quintet, and thus the Quintet of the Hot Club of France was formed. The performances and recordings that they produced together between 1934 and 1939 are engraved in the annals of jazz history as one of the few original and inspirational contributions from a European band of that era. By 1938, French engagements for the quintet were drying up. It was at this point that the quintet embarked on a number of foreign tours across Europe, appearing most frequently in England, where working conditions were better, and a loyal fan base awaited them. Ted Cherrett, a lifelong devotee of Django's music, was a guitarist in a British military jazz band during the Second World War, and remembers first seeing the quintet play in the summer of 1938 in London.
That was terrific. They played behind the curtain, before the curtain went up. They were sitting there and they started a number, you know, and all of a sudden the curtain went up and there was Django sitting there. Absolutely terrific. He always got a good applause out after every number. Really brought the house down, you know, it was terrific. But he used to sit there so quiet and still, and his fingers used to tear all over the place, you know. Terrific.
With increased success, Django began to earn himself a reputation as a difficult and unreliable character, sometimes not showing up for concerts and recording sessions, all of which caused friction within the quintet.
Well, the idea I have about his character is from Stefan Grappelli, you know, who said basically he's, you know, I mean, he said a lot of things about Django, not when he was asked in a situation like this, but usually quietly round the dinner table. He felt very superior, I think. And he got very conceited, and this is according to Stefan, you know, and socially difficult as well, according to Stefan, you know, because he didn't talk, you know. So Stefan would say, oh, well, I tried to avoid him after the concert because he never say anything. He sit there.
Following a number of recording sessions throughout the spring and summer of 1939, the quintet departed France in August, bound for England once again, and another series of engagements. Just 2 weeks into their tour, the day before they were due to play the Kilburn State Cinema in London, Neville Chamberlain made his declaration of war with Germany.
They were in London when the first sirens sounded, and Django said, "That's it, I'm off." And he literally ran out of the hotel, got a taxi to the station and took the train and down to Dover and got on the boat and went home. Grappelli stayed in London for the duration of the war, so they didn't see each other again until I think it was 1946 when they got together in London again.
Heute müssen wir Selbstmusterung halten und abstoßen, was sich aus Blech erwiesen hat. Und deshalb innerlich nicht zu uns gehört.
The appointment of Adolf Hitler as German Chancellor in 1933 presaged one of the darkest and most stagnant periods in the history of Western art and culture to date. Focused on preservation rather than innovation, Hitler gave his propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels the task of regulating cultural life in Germany, predominantly in order to ensure that Jews, blacks and gypsies could be filtered out of society and prevented from sullying Germany's great artistic heritage. The cabaret and jazz scene, for which Berlin had been so well renowned during the Weimar era of the 1920s, was one of the first victims to feel the heat of Nazi persecution when censorship was reintroduced. By October 1935, the Reich Culture Chamber had imposed a ban on black and Jewish jazz from the airwaves, and in its place, Goebbels instructed radio programmers to play Aryanized, light dance music. Jazz was denigrated as an act of musical race defilement, and black artists were banned from giving concerts in the fatherland. Disgusted by the supposedly base and inferior origins of jazz, Nazi propagandists began to map both Jewish and black stereotypes onto the music simultaneously, until the two were blurred into one primitive and corrupting enemy.
Goebbels dismissed jazz as what he described as nigger kike music, so it was doubly damned in a sense because it was associated with blacks and it was associated with Jews, particularly through the songwriters in Tin Pan Alley and so forth. So it was simply not countenanced in any shape or form.
Besides the radio ban on jazz and a handful of small-scale restrictions issued throughout the 1930s by police and party members in the provincial backwaters of Germany, an official Reich-wide ban on jazz in all its manifestations was never officially enforced. This was in part due to the lack of a clear-cut, centralised policy, and also because Goebbels believed that persuasion rather than outright prohibition could be more effective. What's more, culture chamber officials were often at a loss to define the technical musical differences between black and Jewish jazz and the more tolerable white symphonic jazz, rendering effective regulation of the music difficult.
You know, there's a sense in which jazz music isn't pin downable enough. You get an image, you get a piece of degenerate art, and you can immediately say that's degenerate because of this, that and the other. People try to do that with jazz. They try to say, well, it's degenerate because it's not written down, it's not got this, that and the other. But it's actually harder to pin that label on it. In the end, they just say, well, it's nigger music. You know, it's made by blacks originally, and that's how you can... And, you know, and that works for some Nazis.
However, in the late 1930s and throughout the war, for those who were caught indulging in black, Jewish or American jazz, the penalties could be harsh. Listening to jazz records or a foreign radio station could result in a lengthy concentration camp sentence. When Hitler's panzers swept through France in the spring of 1940, it remained to be seen whether Goebbels would eventually govern cultural activity there equally severely as he had in Germany. The Parisian jazz community held its breath, fearing an end to the city's long and well-earned history of artistic freedom.
Paris sera toujours Paris, la plus belle ville du monde, malgré l'obscurité.
Returning to Paris from London in September 1939, Django found that the capital had altered very little since war had been declared. The French army was mobilised with speed and efficiency, but very few felt an enemy invasion possible, believing the Maginot Line to be an impregnable defence against Hitler's forces. On May the 12th, 1940, news of the German invasion of France reached Paris. Days later, thousands of refugees from the northeast of France began to arrive in Paris. Over the coming weeks, hundreds of thousands of Parisians followed suit, Django and his family amongst them, fleeing towards the south of France. At 5:30 a.m. on June the 14th, 1940, the Germans entered Paris by the Porte de Villette and occupied the city without force.
The Germans walked into Paris without a shot being fired in her defence, and there are these photographs of Hitler and the chiefs of staff by the Eiffel Tower. It becomes ideologically almost acceptable looking, because you've done it with a, I mean, this sounds a terrible thing to say, but in a way with a degree of graciousness.
Django feared for his life, yet he returned to Paris soon after the armistice had been signed. Hopeful that his reputation as a talented performer would help him, Django made arrangements to appear in front of the Nazis' official censorship bureau in Paris. On the condition that his concert programs were submitted for approval before every performance he gave, and warned that bureau officials kept a close eye on performers' actions, Django was free to work again. As the weeks passed by, merchants and restaurateurs, their livelihoods in the balance, reopened for business as usual. Soon enough, the City of Light was illuminated once more, and its inhabitants sought escapism and light relief. Swing was the word on everyone's lips. It wasn't only civilians who sought relief. The German Wehrmacht was looking for entertainment too, and endeavoured to exploit the city's resources to their best potential, even requisitioning many clubs and cabarets for their own use. Montmartre was to retain its status as the pleasure district of Paris. By the autumn of 1940, Django had formed a new quintet of the Hot Club of France. Replacing Grappelli's violin with a clarinet and one of his rhythm guitarists with a drummer, the new quintet had a distinctly American sound, a daring move on Django's part at a time when all things American were under suspicion. By late 1940, Django was a phenomenon, commanding huge fees and eating in the best restaurants while others around him tried to make ends meet. Not only were his records outselling those of the pre-war quintet several times over, but with Stefan Grappelli out of the picture, Django revelled in no longer having to share the limelight with anyone.
This was at a point at when jazz was extending its popularity was extending beyond what it had been, I think, to a degree in the 1930s. It was very much a kind of enclave, aficionados, and so on. Swing became genuinely popular as it had been previously in America. And the figure most strongly identified with that was the figure of Django Reinhardt. So in that sense, he had a higher profile than I think anybody else who was working.
I think that someone like Django Reinhardt's jazz music is a beacon of freedom for French people. They're sitting there and they're thinking, well, you know, they can't oppress this, they can't stop this. We're not going to have to listen to that German martial music.
Nuage, a piece written and recorded by Django in late 1940, was hummed by fans everywhere, replacing the forbidden Marseillaise as an unofficial national anthem. When released on record, Nuage immediately sold 100,000 copies, almost doubling Django's fortunes overnight. Though food and fuel shortages were evident by early 1941, Django never had to go without, as almost anything could be bought at a price in Paris at this time. The first 2 years of occupation continued to bring still more varied work for Django and the quintet, with tours of Belgium, the Côte d'Azur, and even the promise of further dates in Algiers. People continued to marvel at the seemingly inexplicable way in which this gypsy musician not only defied persecution at the hands of the Nazis, but now even managed to travel freely between countries. In the summer of 1942, the Third Reich had been at its strongest. Defeat was on the horizon. By early 1943, the war had shifted in the Allies' favour. Rommel's forces had been defeated at El Alamein, and the Battle of Stalingrad had been lost. Following these two major defeats, a dark cloud of despondency consumed the Nazi propaganda ministry. This cloud soon settled over Paris as well. Met with empty shop windows, Parisians dined on a diet largely consisting of turnip, swede, and coffee made from roasted acorns. A black market in anything from red wine to cigarette butts boomed. Returning in the late spring of 1943 from another tour in Brussels, the changed atmosphere in Paris could not have escaped Django's notice, especially now that ever more frequent bomb raids began to rain down upon the city, claiming hundreds of lives. Over the coming months, pressure mounted on Django from the Nazi Artistic Services Division to undertake the German tour he had so far managed to avoid, entertaining the Wehrmacht on leave or injured at home, and more perilously, at the fighting fronts. Fearing for his life, Django tried to buy himself time, requesting ridiculously high fees, having sworn to himself never to set foot inside Nazi Germany. News must have reached him by this time of Himmler's Auschwitz decree, sentencing all German gypsies to execution. As yet, the decree did not apply to gypsies in occupied France, but it was surely only a matter of time before they were added to Himmler's list.
Because, first of all, he was mixing with German officers and all sorts of people, and journalists, he would have known what was happening in Germany, and he would have known that by beginning of 1944, all the German gypsies were rounded up and gradually sent to camps. But I would have thought that people, gypsies in Western Europe, would have known what was going on in Eastern Europe, in one way or another, and even German soldiers might have boasted about it, you know. So, because they would have come back to France from the Eastern Front on leave, particularly the officers. Therefore, I think Django Reinhardt would have known that gypsies were being killed and think, well, I better get out.
And so, in October of 1943, Django left Paris, bound for the neutral territory of Switzerland. Over the course of approximately 6 weeks, he made 3 attempts to escape across the border. Each time he was arrested and, miraculously, released without punishment.
The Germans were probably going to, have him deported to one of the camps. But he must have said, well, look, I'm what's your name? Oh, it's Django Reinhardt. Oh, yeah, Django Reinhardt. Oh, yeah, well, let's hear you play then. Of course, as soon as he played for the Germans, they could see that he was Django Reinhardt, and they said, oh, fantastic, well, go on, you better get along on your way, go back to Paris, that sort of thing. So he sort of played his way out himself.
However Django managed to convince his captors to release him on 3 separate occasions can never be verified. Suffice to say that after the 3rd attempt, Django realised that his best option was to return to Paris and do the best he could to stay in favour with the Germans. By late spring of 1944, Django was back in the city, living at 6th Avenue Fraught, a secluded and exclusive oasis of calm surrounded on all sides by the chaos of Montmartre. Nazi demands for Django to play in Germany had subsided, as by early 1944, Berlin's jazz scene was almost entirely defunct following heavy bombings, and the system of troupe entertainment was way down on Goebbels' list of priorities. The greatest threat to Django now was the frequent Allied bombing of Paris, and he could often be found hiding in the Pigalle metro station just a few minutes' walk from where he lived. Deciding to keep a lower profile, he took on a club at 62 Rue Pigalle that he christened the Caravan, or La Roulotte. Within months, the Allies had made their invasion at Normandy. De Gaulle begged Eisenhower to detach a column of troops to liberate Paris as soon as possible, fearing the establishment of a Red Commune in the city. Allied forces arrived just in time to restore order, flushing out what German forces remained before the Nazi military governor in Paris, General Dietrich von Choltitz, could change his mind and obey Hitler's recent order to destroy the city. On August the 25th, 1944, de Gaulle arrived in Paris. Choltitz duly signed an agreement to surrender, and a parade took place along the Champs-Élysées, where German forces had celebrated their victory over 4 years earlier. Django had survived the war as a gypsy and a jazz musician. Not only survived, but made obscene amounts of money, lived in luxurious apartments, and enjoyed almost entirely unhindered creative freedom throughout the occupation.
Django's a gypsy, and he's in Paris. Not as a gypsy, he's a star. As I say, I don't know anything. I'm not saying I haven't no idea. But how did this work? I mean, he travelled from Paris to Belgium, 1942, and made a lot of recordings. Now that means, I mean, there's one thing to be in an occupied country with a hostile regime, to sort of stay in one place and somehow make that work, but to travel across to another country and make recordings and travel back as a star and a gypsy.
The possibility that Django collaborated with the Germans in order to survive is a moot point. He certainly played at Wehrmacht requisitioned clubs such as the Moulin Rouge, and is known to have signed autographs for German officer fans. But is this tantamount to collaboration?
He, like all French people, are really trying to get by. You're a professional musician too. You need to work in order to earn money, and you need to work and you want to work for other reasons too. And if that means certain bureaucratic processes need to be dealt with in a particular way, you may do it, because the ultimate objective is bigger than the rather grubby little manoeuvre that you may have to perform to get there.
Hand in hand with the theory that Django may have collaborated with the Nazis is the contention that he could have been unofficially protected by one or more devoted Nazi fans.
One speculation is that there were enough people in high places who kind of said, well, okay, he's a gypsy, he's a jazz musician, but actually I quite like jazz, he's a wonderful musician, I'll make sure that he's protected.
It's possible that he was specifically looked after. It could be that somewhere in the archives there are even memos to that effect.
He obviously must have had protection, some level. And I know when I was a kid there was a German officer who said he looked out for him.
A photograph taken outside La Cigale in 1941, in which Django is pictured with Officer Dietrich Schultz-Kohn, has only fueled the idea that Django may have been protected. The German officer proudly stands on the busy boulevard between Django and 5 other musicians, 4 of them black and the other Jewish. Whether the photograph points towards a special relationship between Django and Schultz-Kohn, it is impossible to say. More likely, when requested to pose for a snapshot such as this, Django had no choice but to acquiesce.
There's a couple of photographs that come from that time where he's having his photo taken with some German officers. But he was a gypsy. He just went along with things. He had a pretty sort of laissez-faire attitude, you know. Ended up somebody taking oh Django, would you mind standing there? I'm going to take a picture of you with Colonel Holtz or whoever it was, you know. Yeah, okay. You know, as easy as that. So there was nothing more sinister than that, you know, I don't think.
Partly due to the fact that Django lived in luxury apartments rather than a caravan throughout the war, and partly because French gypsies were never included in the Auschwitz decree before the liberation of France, it's unlikely that Django's gypsy origins would ever have led him to Auschwitz. This is not to say, however, that French gypsies didn't suffer during the war. In France, the authorities began to incarcerate nomadic French gypsies in early 1940. Though only a small fraction of these gypsies were to be sent to the death camps before the liberation of France, around 5,000 were incarcerated in total, an unrecorded number of whom died of malnutrition and disease. Hundreds more were undoubtedly shot in cold blood at roadsides. At least another 5,000 house-dwelling gypsies in France, of which Django was one, escaped persecution on a technicality of the law. By living in houses, these gypsies could avoid carrying the identity cards that would enable the French authorities to track them down.
The point about France, as opposed to most other countries, is that a distinction was made between nomadic gypsies and gypsies living in houses, and nothing happened at all to any gypsy living in a house throughout the war. It might have happened later if the war had continued. Now, Django Reinhardt was probably not classed as a nomad, because I doubt whether he was wandering around in a horse and cart at that time. He was probably living in a house, so from that point of view he wouldn't have been affected by this law.
However, as a Belgian gypsy by birth, with Belgian papers, Django was more at risk than most.
Once the north of France became part of Belgium, it came under the same law as the Germans applied to Belgium, and in Belgium all gypsies were taken to the camps, mainly Auschwitz, whether they were nomadic or not. Now what happened next was they tried to look for Belgian gypsies in the camps in France, and gypsies in France with Belgian passports were in some cases sent to Belgium, but Django Reinhardt was not in a camp, so it didn't apply to him.
Thankfully for Django, the Nazi authorities in Belgium didn't extend their searches to include Belgian gypsies living in houses in France, though in all likelihood he would never have been sent to Auschwitz as long as he continued to be useful to the Germans. Well known across Europe for his work with the quintet in the 1930s, Django was readily exploitable as a star during the occupation. Although his music provided an undeniably important boost to the morale of French civilians, in reality he posed very little threat to the authority of the Nazi regime in Paris.
Vichy France is controlled, it's under control. It's only once there were problems with that control that they might think about arresting someone like Django Reinhardt. You know, what's he doing? He's playing jazz music, he hasn't even got lyrics. It might be decadent music, but it's not a focus enough for opposition to the Nazis, I don't think.
What influenced Django's survival, perhaps more than anything else, was the fact that Joseph Goebbels took a pragmatic approach to the regulation of jazz in the occupied territories, as he also did to a certain extent in Germany. Even before the war, Goebbels could see how popular jazz was, and that an outright ban would be difficult to enforce and cause potential unrest. Besides which, people were spending Reichsmarks in fistfuls in the dance halls and clubs of Germany's major cities, all helping to bolster the economy.
Es mag gut sein, Macht zu besitzen, die auf Gewehren ruht. Besser aber und beglückender ist es, das Herz eines Volkes zu gewinnen und es auch zu behalten.
You appropriate it, you don't ban it outright, on the grounds that, and I'm speculating, but on the grounds that it would not be enforceable. You can create a whole series of statutory measures, but they're only ever good as how enforceable they may be.
Goebbels' official stance on jazz was largely dependent on the desires of the Wehrmacht, either at the front or on vacation, and to a lesser extent the demands of civilians. He was also under pressure to compete with the appeal of Allied Forces radio and V-disc records, and hence was forced to acknowledge that jazz could serve similar propaganda functions to the good of the Reich.
But then they found that, in fact, what was their best way of selling their propaganda? We'll play some jazz at the beginning of it.
Germany calling, Germany calling, Germany calling.
Another war, another prophet, another Jewish business trick. Another season, another reason for making whoopee. A lot of dough.
So when they send Lord Haw across the airwaves, they play some jazz first, because they know that's going to hook an audience. So Goebbels, the great master propagandist, you know, whatever he feels about jazz, if he was to play Wagner, everyone would turn off.
It was this pragmatism that led to a disparity between what was officially forbidden in the fatherland and what was unofficially countenanced in Paris. Goebbels made a promise to the Wehrmacht, "Everybody wants in Paris," a phrase that teased troops with the tantalizing prospect of forbidden pleasures in reward for their continued loyalty.
Paris, during the war, was regarded as the place. I mean, it was the place where you would go on leave. It was regarded as particularly attractive. It had attractions more than anywhere else. You have to remember at the same time that under conditions of the occupation, you have to manage the local people. You simply do not use brutal means to suppress a population if you can get away with doing it in alternative ways.
Indeed, Hitler had little desire to impose a strict fascist regime in Paris, at least initially, in order to gain the cooperation of the French and exploit the country's economy to aid the war effort. By 1943, France had become the principal supplier of foodstuffs, raw materials, manufactured goods, and labour to the Reich. As far as the Nazis were concerned, the scourge of jazz in the occupied territories could be dealt with later. It was in the midst of this atmosphere of controlled decadence that Django played out his part, not so much officially protected as officially exploited. As far as somebody like Goebbels was concerned, the grand shows, the foreign tours, the travelling and recording would all have been considered as just a small part of the French contribution to the German war effort. Despite Django's delusions of grandeur, whether we choose to call it collaboration or not, the fact is that Django, like his contemporaries, had to play and perform in order to stay alive. We can never know for certain exactly how Django managed to survive the occupation, if he was protected, or to what extent he collaborated. Theories that attempt to explain this period in Django's life are mostly founded on thin and unverifiable anecdotal evidence. The mystery of his gypsy background, along with his preternatural talent and a premature death at the age of just 43, have formed a ready foundation upon which the myth of Django continues to be built.
Django represents perhaps par excellence the romantic, the gypsy, the artist who is configured in a particular way, and part of the mythologizing process very much likes the idea of preserving or even adding to this romantic figure. His disappearances was some mysterious German officer fan assisting him in some way or protecting him in some way. There is a sense in which we might perhaps like to believe that, even though we don't know that it's true.
What we can be sure of is that during the occupation, Django was integral to the survival of jazz in war-torn Europe. Just as Benny Goodman and Glenn Miller's music came to constitute the soundtrack to a democracy at war after December 1941, so Django represented individuality and freedom of expression in the face of the Nazis' efforts to homogenize society.
During the war, music was the thing that pulled people through. You know, dances and swing bands, and it was at its height, really. It was somehow the perfect antidote to what was going on.
More than this, Django, along with a handful of others during the 1930s and early 40s, had effectively appropriated the American jazz idiom, nurtured and modified it, and made it truly European.
Django Reinhardt was the first great European jazz musician. Probably remains the most famous and the most honoured European jazz musician worldwide, ever.
He had an enormous impact not only on the French people, he had an enormous impact worldwide, and he had a great impact on all the great guitar players, if we specifically think about guitar playing.
Stefan used to go and make records with every famous guitar player, and so he'd say to me, well, I have to make a record with Belize tomorrow. And I go, oh, that's great, Steph. He goes, well, maybe. And then he'd do the record and come back and say, how was he? He said, well, it was okay, you know. But I tell you something, if Django was alive, he would kill them all.